Hello, everyone. We are live here at the Rational Standard. Today is a special day, not just for Americans, but for all of us who are liberty inclined, classical liberals, libertarians, classical conservatives, because today, on the 4th of July, 250 years ago, 1776, probably the most important act of decolonization occurred when the erstwhile British colonists of the American colonies adopted their Declaration of Independence, which is not simply a legal instrument of import to the Americans themselves, but to all of us who value freedom and political self-determination, perhaps in particular. It is from the Declaration of Independence that those very important words in liberal thought come from the idea that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted amongst men, deriving their powers from the consent of the governed, and that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it. That's almost classical liberalism in its political sense, perfectly summarized. Although I do prefer Jefferson's original formulation of life, liberty, and property rather than the pursuit of happiness, but you can't have it all. But that happened 250 years ago, and we as liberals all around the world celebrate this day with our American friends. It's been a tough ride for America and for the world. But we at the Rational Standard, I'm joined, of course, by David Ansara and Nicholas Woode-Smith is with us again today. So welcome, guys. We thought we would take this auspicious day to discuss the rocky relationship between the United States and South Africa recently, just to provide some context. And shout out to Ronaldo Gous who put this on my radar. I actually had missed this when it originally happened. So on the 17th of June of 2025, that's last month, um, a Mr. Stube, Americans have interesting uh, surnames, introduced a bill to the House of Representatives, HR 4051, which can be shortened to Addressing Hostile and Anti-Semitic Conduct by the Republic of South Africa Bill. And what this effectively does, let me share my screen just very briefly. Here we go. Is that as of the previous executive order by Trump, it kind of identifies certain, let's say, bad conduct by the South African government. It says the government of South Africa in recent years engaged in repeated diplomatic and legal actions targeting the state of Israel and Jewish communities under the guise of international law. These actions include the misuse of international legal institutions to advance politically motivated and anti-Semitic narratives inconsistent with objective human rights norms. The government of South Africa has increasingly aligned itself with authoritarian regimes and global actors hostile to U.S. national interests and democratic values. And then he says that Americans obviously shouldn't be paying for that. So the this congressman at least identifies these things again, and then what the bill would do if Congress adopts it is that it would suspend direct assistance to the South African government. There are certain exceptions to that: humanitarian aid, public health programs, and perhaps most interestingly, it would include targeted sanctions against South African officials. So it doesn't identify them by name, but it does say that those current or former officials who promote or implement anti-Semitic policies or rhetoric in an official capacity uses their offices to unjustly target Israel or Jewish individuals through international courts or diplomatic platforms, or, and this is an interesting one, engages in gross corruption including the misuse of foreign aid, sure, but also public funds in general. So a lot of people in and around our government kind of would be caught up in that. It requires that there be a report on this, and that once that report has been made and the Americans are happy, then these targeted sanctions would be suspended. And none of this stands in the way of trade between South Africa and the United States or restricts private aid and so on. So this is an interesting thing that happened recently, and why it's important to point out that we didn't pick up on this is that the South African government almost certainly did pick up on this, because as we've pointed out before, it would seem, I'm just going to share a different screen, it would seem that the South Africans are sabotaging the relationship on purpose, because what happened on the 1st of July, this is now 2 weeks after this thing happened, this bill was introduced in Congress. The deputy minister of DIRCO, that's international relations, went to the Iranian embassy in Pretoria, presumably, and signed a book of condolences saying how sorry the South African government is for all the Iranian kind of missiles and nuclear research that has been destroyed. And kind of I tried in vain going back to October the 7th, it's October 8th, October 9th, 10th of 2023, to find South Africa going to the Israeli embassy and signing a book of condolences back then. I couldn't find that. Maybe I missed it. I hope I did. But yeah, that's kind of the lowdown. We are continuing to spit in the faces of the Americans in the week that apparently the government is begging Trump and his government to extend the period of time for us to negotiate a trade deal. So yeah, let me. It's a long introduction. Let me throw it open to you, Nicholas. What's your take on all of this?
So honestly, the NC and the South African government is just completely delusional. We know this already with its economic policies, the fact that they can keep thinking they can keep pushing BE and terrible policies. But I genuinely do believe that the NC has this, the Marxists are always quite good at delusion. In communist China, they genuinely thought that they could breed pigs and cows together to create a super animal. They genuinely believed you could whip the ground to make it grow rice better. So the ANC is pushing the same thing because they believe that they all have the strongest army, that China, Russia, Iran, all best friends with each other, and they're going to be best friends with them, and they're going to be able to take on the West. I remember attending one of those things where the military's ammunition is expiring, so they decide to go fire it over a bay. And it was in False Bay a few years ago. And there were some people with ANC shirts there. And they were screaming, Amandla, we're going to destroy America, we're going to crush the settler dogs. And they're all saying this. And I'm thinking like, okay, this is a fun spectacle. It's one armored car firing a machine gun into a bay. Do they I don't think the NC realizes the GDP of the West, the actual logistical capacity they have, and just also how incompetent not just South Africa is, but all what they call themselves the axis of resistance. I think it's very appropriate that they call themselves Axis, because like the World War II's Axis, it's all just a bunch of rogue states who want to misbehave and commit evil, and they're not actually going to help each other. The Nazis and the Japanese didn't really actually help each other. All they did was kind of to run interference for each other. Okay, I'm going to distract the Americans on the one flank, or you distract them on the other flank. But at the same time, they weren't actually working together well. There was plenty of cases of the Japanese and the Nazis actually sabotaging each other's genocides. There was Nazis who were helping Manchurians escape the Japanese, and there were Japanese people helping Jews escape the Holocaust. But that aside, South Africa is very bad at picking sides because they are completely fanatical about their Marxist view of the world. And their Marxist view of the world is not based in reality. It's not based in facts. It's a checklist of different things that they are supposed to believe. They're supposed to believe Russia great because apparently it's still the Soviet Union, China great because it's apparently still communist, Iran great because they give us a lot of money. At least that is based on some sort of rationality, but that money's going to run out. But also there's possibly more there, a different ideology which is not Marxist, and that the DIRCO is very much captured by an element that the United States has been trying to warn us about for a long time. I don't know if you guys remember, for years, the US Embassy would be reminding us about the threat of terror in South Africa. Like nothing happens. We don't get any bombings, whatever. I think South Africa is violent enough that if there is a terrorist attack, we'll probably just brush it off as just a normal criminal act. But I think the reason that we don't get direct terror attacks in this country is that a lot of the terrorist organizations realize we are captured already. Our infrastructure is so flimsy and so untransparent that they can use it to. It's more important for them to use our infrastructure without rocking the boat too much. I spoke to a confidential guy in the armed forces a long time ago, and I asked him, "Are you afraid that Islamic State, in north of Mozambique, is going to threaten South Africa directly?" And he said to me, "He's not afraid. It's already happening." And he says they're already in the Union Building. And this is a high up guy, can't name names for obvious reasons, but I think that it's very much the case. It explains why we've got quite radical converts like Naledi Pandor, who who've used her position when she was Minister of Durko to push an incredibly pro-Islamist agenda. Because it wasn't just the usual mainstream, thoughtless, misinformed opinion of just feeling bad for Gazans, but it was actively pushing, with a little bit of skewed language, the extermination of the Israeli state. It was pushing for an expansion of global jihad. It was backing Iran, which is proven without a doubt. It's one of those litmus tests we should have, that if someone truly believes that Iran is building nuclear capabilities for peaceful nuclear production, despite being one of the leaders of the world in terms of oil production, one of the leaders for hydrocarbon, one of the largest natural gas reserves in the world. Plus, they also have got they've got hydroelectric dams and stuff as well. I'm pretty sure they could also get coal if they really want to diversify that much. It just doesn't make any sense for them to have a peaceful nuclear program, and yet they say repeatedly that they want to destroy Israel. Yeah, I think that I love that bill. I think that should be what we call the big beautiful bill, not the other one. And I like that it's not targeting South African civilians. I like that it is focused on what's actually happening. And I think that anyone who vaguely reads what I write about this topic will know everything. I can fill in the blanks.
Thanks, David. Any takes on your side from this? I think what Nicholas says is important about this bill not targeting the economy in general. I think that's a key thing, and it does show that the Americans do have some kind of restraint in this regard.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose the Americans have had some interesting experiences with targeted sanctions in the recent past. If you consider the sanctions against the Russians in the wake of the invasion of Ukraine, in many respects, Russia has been able to withstand some of the headwinds associated with those sanctions, even though it's made life very difficult for some of the oligarchs. But they still find ingenious ways of circumventing those. But yeah, I mean, one of the risks with sanctions, and we've seen it in places like Zimbabwe and Venezuela, is that it's used by these local authoritarians or strongmen to say, oh, look, the West is trying to bully us, trying to undermine our sovereignty, and this is neo-imperialism writ large, and we need to resist this kind of interference coming from the West. So it's not always that this instrument is hugely effective, but I think it also sends a very strong political message. And targeting the elites, I think, is important, making it difficult for them to travel, for them to move assets around the world. But I mean, one of the risks that we saw out of the Russian situation is that the United States froze Russia out of the SWIFT payment system, which incentivized a lot of countries to now seek alternative means of cross-border payments, right? So there are some of these second-order effects that you have to be careful of. But I think the big picture here is that South Africa's foreign policy position, the chickens are coming home to roost, because for a very long time we've been able to play both sides of the West versus the rest, or the so-called global South, that we're somehow seen as these champions of democracy, the miracle of the democratic transition. And as we've mentioned on this show before, James Myburgh of Politics Web, he has this very interesting analogy, which is that South African foreign policy has been broadcast on a dual frequency, that there's two channels of communication. So channel one is for a domestic audience, and that's all about African nationalism, socialism, the National Democratic Revolution, condoning things like songs like Kill the Boer, talking about the original sin, a lot of decolonial kind of rhetoric, anti-settler kind of language. So that's channel one. Channel two is, fluffy marshmallows and rainbows, and that we're the Rainbow Nation, and that it's all about reconciliation and non-racialism, and that we're this country that punches above its weight and could play a meaningful role in fostering dialogue in other conflict-ridden geographies or environments like Northern Ireland or Israel-Palestine, but no. The Trump administration, as Myburgh points out, is tuning out of channel 2 and into channel 1. And I think that's a very important way of thinking about this. And so a lot of these actions now, I think, which the February executive order was almost like an opening salvo, a shot across the bows. But now we're starting to see meaningful, concrete steps being taken by the Americans to start finding those pressure points in South Africa and starting to push those. Also very interesting to see the Afrikaner delegation, Mulder from the Freedom Front, Niasa's Gerard Papenfuss, and who was the third of the three musketeers. The names
Theo de Jager.
Theo de Jager, yeah. So I think another thing to consider there is US commercial interests starting to say, hang on, we're not going to tolerate BEE as a condition of investment. There are over 600 American firms operating in South Africa. And if you can start to push for exemptions, so not only equity equivalence, but actually saying BEE in its entirety should not apply to American investors, that could be a real pressure point. So we're starting to see the diplomatic and the economic forces starting to join up and dovetail there. And so, but cry as you might about America's ultimate interest in this. There's a lot of, gnashing of teeth and wailing about how America's bullying us and undermining our sovereignty. But if you go back a few steps, you can very clearly see that South Africa has been the primary culprit in terms of getting us into this current situation. We have scored own goal after own goal. We've cut off our nose to spite our face, and this is the consequence.
Yeah, I think the key point there is, and we have made it before on the show, is that I guess it's a kind of an issue with how this discourse works, because people talk about these are the American demands, and then on its face that seems like, oh, America has certain interests, and now they are trying to force South Africa into a very inequitable position. That the reality is, listen, look past the word demands and actually read what the Americans expect from us. Then you will discover that, in fact, the so-called demands are in our favor. You can quibble, like with the Ukraine deal, for instance, where I think a lot of people said, well, this deal actually isn't in favor of Ukraine. It's a very clearly slanted pro-American deal that Ukraine might benefit from in certain security aspects. That was very much, I would say, a clear instance of it's not to your benefit as the country on the receiving end. What the Americans are asking of us is, it will benefit us much more than it will benefit the Americans. I mean, we're an important trading partner for the Americans, but if they lose us, it's like, well, damn for them, but for us, it's a disaster. So the Afrikaner delegation met with very senior officials from the administration, from the Office of the Vice President, the American National Security Council, and the Homeland Security Council. They also did a media tour and so on, and they got 4 conditions from the Americans, or 4 requirements that the Americans said to normalize the relationship between South Africa and the US. The first one is the classification of farm attacks as a priority crime. This doesn't benefit the Americans. This is literally just to the benefit of South Africa, its food security, and its own security situation. A clear and unequivocal public condemnation by the ANC of kill the Boer. How would this benefit the Americans? This is not some imperialist kind of resource extraction thing that they're doing. They're saying, hey, your moral compass is fucked as a country. You need to actually sit up straight and condemn these horrendous things that senior politicians in your country are saying. The third thing, no land expropriation without fair market compensation. I mean, that just goes without saying. If we do land expropriation or any expropriation without compensation, that is the beginning of the end of this economy. Then it's over. So that benefits us. And then finally, David, you mentioned this, is the exemption of all US entities from Black economic empowerment, because they regard race-based regulation as a non-tariff trade barrier. So obviously that does benefit the Americans, but that is to trade with us. That is to invest in South Africa. This is the type of thing that if the BEE requirement falls away, they're going to come here, create jobs, invest in the economy. So that is also to our benefit. Now, the key thing here is that we've been apparently these 4 requirements were said to the South African government way back when Ramaphosa went to the White House, but we only hear about them now. And I mean, this is part of, I think, a broader indication of extreme malice from the South African government, because they didn't tell us that these were the requirements, number one. And number two, this week, again, we're asking for an extension of this trade negotiation thing before Trump's hammer falls. And like I posted on X, I'm like, okay, so what has Msebeni Jonas been doing since he was appointed special trade envoy to the US? Has he been hard at work trying to do this negotiation? Last I heard, he hadn't even left South Africa yet. I saw a press release by the presidency from a few weeks ago where they said something about his visa. And I was, no, don't report on his visa. We want to know what progress he's been making. And my gut tells me, and again, I could be wrong, and I hope I'm wrong, that in fact the government has not sent anyone to speak to the Americans about this trade relationship. There is no indication from this government that it intends to do any of these things, at least not immediately. And I think the outreach to the Iranian embassy is just such an obvious, like, this is something they just shouldn't have publicized. Like, if they wanted to keep good relations with the Iranians and normalize relations with the Americans as they said they wanted to, they would not have posted about this on Durko's X account. And yet they posted it and they rubbed it in. Like, we're sending someone to sign the condolences book after the Iranians lost their nuclear capabilities. So my feeling, and it's quite unfortunate. My feeling is that the South African government does not want to normalize relations with the Americans. I think that they want a bad relationship with the Americans, and they are betting. And Nicholas, you referred to this earlier. They are betting on this kind of new kind of world order where the BRICS countries and kind of this axis of resistance takes over as the kind of dominant global power, where this kind of, I don't know why they see Russia and China as part of this kind of deep post-colonial formation. It's a bizarre thing, but they think that's going to work. And as you rightly pointed out, the second Iran was attacked, China and Russia were like, Iran? Who's Iran? We've never heard of Iran. And don't forget about the Armenians. They've been cultivating a very close relationship with the Russians. And then Azerbaijan invaded Armenia, and the Russians were nowhere to be found. They're literally on the Russian border. The Russians left. So it's not going to work out the way the ANC thinks it's going to work out. China is a big trade partner. Russia is a tiny trade partner of ours. But those countries and the BRIC states aren't going to carry South Africa into the future. We do need trade that involves the Americans, and we do need a global order, I would say, that involves the Americans. So the calculation on the part of the ANC is very, very wrong-headed. And I think it's going to blow up in their faces. I'm not sure. I mean, I'm sure I know why they want to alienate the Americans. That to me is clear. They have an ideological dedication, as Nicholas said, to kind of international socialism that's associated with the Russians and the Chinese for some reason, but also this ideological commitment to the destruction of Israel that is indistinguishable between the ANC and Iran. I mean, we're just much further away, so it's far less kind of intense, but it's the same kind of desire, this idea that only the Palestinians really are allowed to be in that region. So I know why they want to alienate the Americans. I just don't know why they think the axis of resistance is actually going to help the ANC at all. Nicholas, any more thoughts on that?
I just wanted to loop around back to the sovereignty came up. One with the fact that sanctions will be brought in, and people say it's neo-imperialism and sanctions, and also that people were saying that when with the initial executive order, people were accusing Trump and the United States of, violating our sovereignty, and then now with this. So I've got an upcoming article which addresses this in detail with every single point. Basically, what you said, Martin, is each of it actually benefits us. But on top of that, even if they didn't benefit us, it's not violating our sovereignty. I think people have this huge misunderstanding of sovereignty actually is. America's sovereignty, its implementation of its own sovereignty allows it to put conditions on its relations with other countries. The only time it would be violating our sovereignty is if it invaded us, if it shot our president in the head and imposed a puppet state on us. It's not doing that. It's saying, hey, if you want to deal with us, and honestly, they're not even threatening cutting off trade. They're threatening corrupt elites, which I really like. I think that South Africans should be for that. That does not violate sovereignty, and it just reminds me of how African countries in the 80s and 90s would call the structural adjustment programs that the IMF and the World Bank those are imposed, but no, it was like, okay, you borrowed money from us, you're unable to fucking pay your loans back. Hey, maybe institute these institutions which have worked everywhere they've been tried, implement them, and maybe and then we'll lend you some more money. And the African countries wept. They had temper tantrums. And to this day, not a single country implemented a single part of the structural adjustment programs, yet they still blame them. South Africa is one of them. They blame neoliberalism for destroying Africa. And I'm like, okay, when was neoliberalism ever tried? It was not. This is not even a case of like people blaming, saying, oh, communism wasn't tried yet. No, they literally did not even try neoliberalism. It's the same thing in South Africa. Have we tried being friendly to the United States? When we did, they literally, the United States helped its friends. It rebuilt Europe. It rebuilt Japan after nuking it twice. You want to be friends with the United States, and I think we're a very foolish country for thinking that we can not only mess with the biggest guy on the block, but the biggest guy on the block who's actually quite nice if you get to know him.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think what was interesting about the 12-day war, which I think that was Trump's good marketing experience that labeled it that. I mean, is just the extent of Israeli and US military power. And I think people often talk about soft power and the kind of influence of culture and so on, but soft power often follows hard power. And I think it was quite extraordinary just looking at that conflict. And first of all, the fact that the Israelis were able to launch such a sophisticated campaign and a very targeted one, which actually avoided large-scale civilian casualties. It was very much targeted at high-ranking IRGC officials, and even to an extent was avoiding direct confrontation with senior military officials. The idea there, I think, was to try and isolate the the IRGC and the mullahs. Sorry, I've just got somebody at my door. Sorry about that. Yeah, so there, yeah, so, and I think that, I mean, if you look at some of the footage there were apartment blocks with a very precise hole in them, which targeted the exact, which is, the remnants of a missile, which targeted the exact bedroom of one of these kind of senior commanders. And taking out a lot of their ballistics capabilities, a lot of their air force. And I think, especially around the context of the war in Ukraine, between Russia and Ukraine, there was a lot of talk about this new era of warfare and drone capabilities being really instrumental. But actually, traditional air dominance really, I think, won this war. And what was very interesting was also Trump's involvement politically for him was very contentious, particularly within his MAGA movement, because a big part of his campaign was around questioning some of the forever wars, the kind of military and diplomatic establishment, the deep state that has an interest in perpetuating conflicts and, some of the very bruising and expensive and protracted wars that characterized US involvement in the Middle East, in Iraq, and also Afghanistan as well. And so he was playing quite a delicate balancing act. But ultimately, I think the success of the war was such that it was bounded in a sense. It didn't have these pretenses to trying to achieve regime change. It was about a very targeted exercise of power, extreme ballistic capabilities, but also very precise. And obviously the B-2 bombs, I mean, there's been some debate around how efficacious that bombing was, but you can only surmise that the nuclear capabilities of Iran have been taken back quite significantly. And I think it was very important to preempt the development of those capabilities, because if you look at the situation with North Korea, my brother actually lives in South Korea, so I have a vested interest in there not being a nuclear holocaust in the Korean Peninsula. But it's now very difficult now that the DPRK has the capability to launch a nuclear bomb. Now the Japanese and the South Koreans are very hesitant to have some kind of military conflagration that could escalate and go nuclear and go hot. So removing those capabilities before they were developed, I think, was very important. And yeah, just going back to the domestic context, I think the signing of the condolence book was actually a massive L for the South Africans, because I mean, ultimately, it's just this limp gesture of like, well, sorry that some of your senior personnel were taken out, and I think it's really tilting at windmills. I mean, there's nothing really that the South Africans can do. So yeah, I mean, I actually think it showed weakness on behalf of our diplomatic establishment, whereas I think they thought it was a very strong signal of solidarity. I think it was kind of lame in the end.
Yeah, absolutely. But I mean, that's part of the issue. It's like you're gonna do the lame thing. Rather just don't do anything. Then you can privately express your solidarity and maintain your apparent desire to normalize relations with the Americans. And the fact that they concluded on the side of let's do something lame and then show the Americans kind of that we are willing to even do lame things just to get at them. And to me, that's kind of part of the pettiness with which kind of Ronald Lamola and Cyril Ramaphosa are approaching foreign policy in this country. Yeah, I have some thoughts on kind of the 13-day war. I think you're right. Trump did campaign kind of on a more isolationist platform, and I think throughout America's recent history, all presidents that campaigned on a non-interventionist foreign policy ultimately kind of brushed up with reality once they took office and understood that those fantasies don't actually kind of play out in practice, and that if you want to kind of have nice trade and so on, and kind of good relations with the world, you are going to have to do some cleaning every now and then of the neighborhood. But he did balance that. He didn't go further than the nuclear program. So I understand that for the Americans. I'm a little bit I have a question mark when it comes to the Israelis, and I mentioned this on Big Daddy Liberty show last week on Sichlin Gobez's Liberty and Friends. Um, this idea of kind of fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice, shame on me. We're now kind of at fool me the 11th time or the 12th time and the 13th time. Israel will never have peace. The Jewish state will never ever have peace for as long as these regimes are allowed to kind of they get a bloody nose, and then they kind of and they always lose. I mean, let's be clear about that. They've never once come close to victory. I think October 7th was the closest that they ever came to victory, and even that was not very close to victory. They always lose, but they always then go back, redouble their efforts, rebuild, and then attack Israel again, and a bunch of civilians always have to die. This is not the first time that the Israelis went into Gaza. There was a big operation about a decade ago. Again, a lot of civilians had to die, and it just keeps happening because Israel is not allowed to defeat its enemies. Douglas Murray is excellent on this. I think he's really painted this picture very clearly, and I think it just makes intuitive sense. If your neighbor keeps lobbing grenades kind of over your fence, and you can lob some of them back, and you throw a grenade every now and then he says he's very sorry, and then the grenades keep lobbing, it's going to keep happening until you go and kill your neighbor. I mean, let's just kind of say the quiet part out loud. You have to go and kill him, or someone needs to come and arrest him and drag him away, and there he goes. That needs to happen. He needs to be neutralized. I think this is going to be the same story with Iran. Unlike the Saudis, unlike the Jordanians, unlike the Egyptians, the Iranians have a very clear ideological dedication to the elimination of Israel. The Arab world has always shown sympathy for the Palestinians, and you can understand that. They share religion, they share culture. It makes sense, but the rest of the Arab world has been more pragmatic about this than the Iranians have ever been. Um, and then I was quite inspired by Netanyahu, who I have certain worries about him as a domestic politician. I think some of his domestic policies are absolutely kind of atrocious, but he made I think two or three very good speeches where he said that the people of Israel stand with the people, with the Persian people, with the Iranian people who have a long history of the Jewish people, and he called upon them to rise up and replace this tyrannical regime that they have in Tehran. And that was exciting for me, because that seemed to me to be an indication that there is a dedication, at least not the Americans, the Israelis and the sensible people in the Middle East had a dedication to regime change in Tehran. So I hope that is still on the agenda. I've already started seeing indications that there's a crackdown in Iran on the opposition, that people are being arrested, people are being killed, opponents of the regime. Um, when in fact there should now really be a push to replace that regime with something a little bit more liberal and moderate. So I'm hoping that's still on the agenda somewhere. I doubt that the Americans are going to get intimately involved. I do think at some point they won't really have a choice. I think if J.D. Vance takes over in the U.S. as president, he's far more isolationist than Trump is, but I think he's also going to brush up against reality. But I do think that now is the moment for the people of Iran, and for regional stability. The regime is at its weakest. Now is the moment to really press the advantage. And yeah, I know people will say, well, warmonger, warhawk. Yes, I am all of those things. If it's in the name of securing long-term and sustainable peace, because while the American approach to war, I think, has in certain respects lacked, it has been very haphazard. a very haphazard approach to war. I think they are now switching to a very haphazard approach to peace. This kind of idea that we're just gonna kind of zap them and then we're gonna leave again and then they're gonna hit us again and we're gonna zap them again. It's like that is not sustainable. That is not real peace. That is actually just looking for more trouble. So I do hope that we are now in the final stages of the Iranian regime. And if so, then the Americans will again be able to take credit for doing something I think very good, because there is in fact a moderate opposition in that country, which was not in Iraq, which was not in Afghanistan. There is in fact in Iran a moderate opposition waiting and ready to take the reins. Nicholas, any thoughts from you?
So yeah, you're exactly right. Iran is not its people, its culture is not a strict theocratic culture. They are being occupied by a power that does not represent the majority of the people. The fact that they keep having drama, despite the hijab laws and the very strict decency laws and religious laws that they have, it keeps getting opposed by people on the ground. You have these brave women who know that they're going to be mutilated or even killed, but they still stand up against it. That shows that the undercurrents of Iranian society do not like their government. And it's not their government. They're an occupying power. And this is the case in so many of these revolutionary countries, is that they do not represent the will of the people. The Bolsheviks were not supported by the Russian people. They were the least popular revolutionary movement, but they used violence to take over. Same happened in Iran. It was a minority of fanatics who used violence because most people are reasonable. They're not going to pick up a gun and go fight people. They just want peace, and they're just going to there's a character in Catch 22 that represents this quite a lot. There's an Italian man who, when the Germans came, so when Mussolini rose to power, he waved the Italian flag. When the Nazis came and occupied, he waved the swastika. When the Americans came in, he waved the red, white, and blue. And he says he's just going to support you ever, because that's just how it is. That's how he stays alive. That's how he stays prosperous. That's how he stays happy. But that doesn't work, because that only works if you're not doing anything to brush up against, to rock any boats. If you're a woman in Iran and you want to have the bare minimum of freedom, if you don't want to be treated like property, you can have acid thrown in your face. So I think it is imperative for any country, any society in this world who believes the bare minimum that women should not be treated as slaves. I'm not even talking about the other stuff. Then they should be opposing the current regime in Iran, and they should be supporting Operation Rising Lion, which that is a lot of people, the party analysts were talking about that name, try and bring back the lion, which is an old Iranian flag. I personally would love them to rename themselves to Persia again. I think that's a cooler name, but that's just my personal opinion. I'd also like to rename Istanbul to Constantinople, but I think I might just be a medieval history nut. So I do think that Israel definitely wanted a party regime change. Regime change is a gamble, though. It's very hard to put in. I think it's much better than just occupying and invading a country. I think there have been regime changes in history which have worked. Japan is this peaceful country that just creates cars and animated TV series because the Americans were able to impose a regime change on them. Germany became this a very peaceful country because West Germany was effectively had regime change. It can work, and I think the problem is sometimes America picks silly people, but honestly, a lot of the time it's not them doing it. A lot of the time they let they back the wrong side, or they back a flawed democracy without knowing things on the ground, and that's just going to happen. But I do still think, for example, that the South Vietnamese government was better than the North Vietnamese government. They weren't perfect, and I think the Americans did some really silly things there. I think that when they saw that the writing was on the wall and the South Vietnamese didn't like their current government, they should have said, okay, have some elections. We're not going to let the communists come in, but have some elections and elect a better person who's not going to, I think he was going around cracking down on Buddhists, which is not something you should be doing in a predominantly Buddhist country. But yeah, no, I think that Iran, it's not impossible that there could be a regime change. I remember, I think it was a year or two ago, and hopefully it's still the case, that Iran has the fastest growing Christian population in the world. And so we might not even see a moderate Muslim uprising there. We might see a Christian uprising there, We might see a Christian Iran being a friend in the Middle East neighborhood with Israel in the future. That's a nice alternative history. At the same time, it would be good for them to just become pragmatic. Because the big thing with the Arab states is they pay lip service to, as you say, they pay lip service to being pro-Palestine. But I think that they are far less fanatical anymore. They're far less Sunni or Salafi anymore. They've seen the virtue of capitalism. They've seen the virtue of realpolitik, and and now it's just that they have to deal with some of their clerical factions. That's the only reason they haven't normalized relations with Israel, is that they're worried about being overthrown themselves by a bunch of terror groups that they have to put up with. Terror group probably funded by Iran. So if Iran's government was overthrown, I think a lot of things would be sorted out.
Yeah, so I mean, you really have to think of Iran as the head of the octopus. And in the immediate wake of October 7th, I mean, the odds were really stacked against Israel. I mean, they just had this huge breach of their southern border, the most horrific human rights abuses during October 7th. And we're really reeling from that. And the force of Hezbollah in the north. I mean, I actually went to northern Israel in May 2024. Well, I went to all parts of Israel, but we went up to the top there, and there was some very serious security threats. I mean, they showed us videos of farmhouses being hit by anti-tank missiles that were being launched from Lebanon, and these were kind of security personnel who were, we were being briefed inside a huge bunker and so on. So, there were, some real threats from Hezbollah. And, the Houthis were also quite strong as well. And all of these were Iranian proxies, right? So the fact that this war targeted the head of the octopus, and I think what was interesting about it as well was that there were simultaneously these talks happening, as well as the threat of military action. But sometimes you do actually have to follow through on the threat of military action. Like, it's not enough just to have this incredible military capability. You do have to show your power. And I think Martin's right. I think there will be a lot of hostility towards Israel, and that sentiment won't go away. But if you look at the current situation you have after the beeper bombs of Hezbollah that really eliminated all of the senior leadership. I mean, Hezbollah is basically just like some small political party in Lebanon now. It was almost like a kind of a state within a state previously, and really terrorized the Lebanese as well. The fact that Hamas has been, largely contained, and now the Iranians themselves, also Syria as well, there's been regime change there, which I'm not really that familiar with what's happening in Syria, but the landscape has shifted. And if you go back in history, if you kind of think of like the 6-Day War that was in 1967, I mean, those Arab states that fought against Israel, Egypt, Syria, and Jordan, Israel, I wouldn't say it has like warm relations with Egypt and Jordan, but they're not hostile relations. And that is kind of what you want, right? I mean, the Jordanians probably have a healthier relationship with Israel. I'm now kind of brushing up on the limits of my kind of regional knowledge here. But that is kind of what you want, which is cessation of hostilities. And many people, see the events of October 7th as a consequence of Israel's growing diplomatic relations with countries like the Abraham Accord countries, and that Hamas was basically trying to sabotage potential closening of relations between Israel and Saudi Arabia. And so this, I think, does open the window for maybe normalization of diplomatic relations in the Middle East. And I mean, that could potentially open up like a period of much greater peace in the region.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the Abraham Accords is probably going to be one of Trump's good legacies. Uh, but yeah, I don't. I think there is something of a substantive difference between Egypt, I mean, throughout that period, and Jordan throughout that period, and the Iranians. It's quite difficult to kind of put your finger on it because they are all Islamic, legal Islamic states, and that's a problem. But they've always seemed to have a very pragmatic streak that it just seems that after the Iranian Revolution, the Iranians never really had. I mean, I think Iran is a far more sophisticated economy, for instance, and perhaps as more sophisticated people than North Korea. But I do see the Iranian regime and the kind of North Korean regime almost in the same kind of light. They're fanatical. And they're fanatical about the wrong things, and they and I must actually add the South African government, the current government, into that category, where there is a there is such dedication to their ideological prescripts that it becomes irrational. I think all governments are fundamentally ideological, but there comes a point, like uh, uh, Colombia and the US, for instance, where Colombia said, no, we won't do this with the Americans. And then Trump slapped them with certain tariffs. And then they said, okay, we'll come to the party. And that's happened with several countries now, uh, except South Africa. South Africa has kicked back every single time. North Korea is inaccessible through dialogue. And I think to a large degree, Iran fits that same mold, which the other Arab states is what we're not. It wasn't a problem there. So yeah, I'm a bit worried that unless there's yeah, I mean, I wanted to say unless there's a cultural shift in the Iranian regime, but I mean that's you just have to get a different regime. I don't think that it's within the toolbox of the current Iranian government to be able to shift away from what it has dedicated itself to, and it doubled down hard after the 13-day war. It doubled down very hard. They declared that they won this war, and you can say it's all about saving face and so on. Of course, that does play a big role, but there has been no humble pie that's been eaten. You would have wanted at least some kind of rapprochement between Iran and Israel, but that's just not on the agenda. So I also don't think it's sustainable to force that, because they actually have to want to do it, like the other Arab states do. Um, so yeah, I'm optimistic about Israel's relations with the other Muslim states that surround it. I'm very not optimistic about Israel's relations with Iran and Iran's relations with the West. I think that's always going to be a nibbling issue, kind of biting at the heels of the West. And unfortunately, and this isn't just the Middle East. The West has a problem that other civilizations don't. Other civilizations, they might be too weak to do this, but nonetheless, other civilizations, when they identify an existential threat to their civilization, they try to destroy that threat. That is what Chinese civilization does. That is what kind of African civilization does. There's a threat, we're going to destroy it, we're going to kill it. The West does not do that, uniquely does not do that. The West says, oh my goodness, there's an existential threat, let's talk about it, let's kind of try and figure this out. And that's worked out well in some respects, and in other respects, it has led to a situation, for instance, where Europe's eastern border is being invaded by Russia, and no one actually knows what to do, when the answer should be kind of plainly obvious what to do. And there's various other examples. Wokeness in the midst of the West you would imagine that far more tangible action would have been taken against this civilizational poison. Instead, no, actually, none of that has been on the agenda. So this is a problem for the West. It doesn't deal with problems with any sense of finality that is required, especially when you're coming up against countries like Iran, but like North Korea, like Russia, and of course like the People's Republic of China, which is a problem that we keep kind of shifting with our shoulder into the future. But at some point there's going to be a reckoning. What are we going to do about China? Because they're uh, in many ways, China is David. You kind of refer to Iran as kind of the octopus, the snake's head. Actually, I think it goes all the way to Beijing. Ultimately, that is really the safe harbor of all the bad things happening in geopolitics in the world today is Beijing, and the at least implicit umbrella that it provides them. It's very implicit because often Beijing leaves its allies out to dry, but its presence is a problem. That is the single most biggest threat to kind of very good Western hegemony. So the West, I hope at some point, it's certainly not happening now, and but I hope at some point the West, and maybe with Israel's wise counsel, because I think Israel as a Western country understands this, will get to the point of understanding that it has to deal with these things with a sense of finality. It needs to understand that there are many threats to the West. The quasi-liberal idea that we must just speak to these people and convince them about how nice freedom is going to work. That thesis has collapsed very, very finally, I would say, and that Western liberalism has to kind of readjust its posture in geopolitics and understand that actually freedom, rationality, reason are not things that we get to debate. These are things that you just have to do. You don't have a choice. And if we don't do that, those threats to the West will eat up the West. They will eventually destroy the West. Um, yeah, but I think that's probably the topic exhausted for today. I'm going to give each of you a final word before I close. I know it's a little bit shorter than usual, but some of us have to run away quite soon. So, Nicholas, I'll give you your last word.
You summed that up all perfectly. My last words is that Ukraine, Israel, Taiwan, these are the real front lines to defend Western civilization. And I think that we need to support them wholeheartedly, regardless of our petty wokeness, which I am more and more convinced is a psyop being pushed by Russia and China. And I know that Iran has been actually actively pushing it. But I think that hopefully more and more people wake up to that fact.
Yeah, Martin, I think your last comment, I think, is really worth echoing. I think Western civilization is something that we should actually be proud of. And I think there's some very strong voices within the West that are doubtful of that. So I think the West needs to reclaim its self-confidence, and that means sometimes you have to fight for your values. You first need to understand what your values are, the primacy of the individual, free markets, those kind of things, the rule of law. And definitely as classical liberals, we owe a great debt of gratitude to the Western tradition. The West has produced some of the great liberal thinkers. It's also produced some of the most terrible collectivist thinkers like Karl Marx and Adolf Hitler. But I think if you reflect on that great fight for the future of Western civilization, World War II, I'm very glad that my grandfather fought against Rommel's soldiers in the deserts of North Africa and in Italy. I think freedom is worth fighting for. And I think in many respects, those of us who consider ourselves Westerners, we've become used to a sort of a default state of peace, that it's a kind of a natural phenomenon, but actually it isn't. I think violence, contestation, that is very natural. And if you want to live in a peaceful, orderly, sincerely dignified kind of society, you need to be prepared to fight for those values. So I think a lot of that thinking is upstream from the work that we do in the policy space. But yeah, we don't fight with guns. We fight with our keyboards and our mice. But sometimes ultimately you have to be prepared to to put force behind your ideas.
Yeah, thanks. And I think that does bring it full circle back to kind of the auspicious day that we're celebrating today, and that is the U.S. Declaration of Independence, which is, I think, will be remembered for millennia as one of the central texts of Western civilization. Specifically, it's on the principle of political self-determination, where the Americans really set out what the basis is of Western government, and in that act they showed that it's not just something that is limited to Western Europe. There's a very malicious crowd in this discourse that when someone says West, they see and hear white. That is obviously not what it is. The To the degree that the whole world has already incorporated Western thinking into their culture. I mean, China has the People's Republic of China, fake China, has adopted a hell of a lot of Western commercial thinking, a lot of Western cultural thinking into how they do things, and that is why it's the second biggest economy in the world. There is no other reason for why China is today the second biggest economy in the world. It is only because it has domesticated a lot of Western thought, and the West itself is a recipient of a lot of good ideas from Arab civilization, from Eastern civilization, and it has synthesized those ideas really into, and I know this is something that hurts a lot of people's ears when they hear it, but really into a universal code that really is applicable across cultures, across societies, and yeah, we have to feel proud of that, and we have to feel very jealously guarded about that.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at Japan, sorry to interrupt you, Martin.
Yeah, please.
I mean, like Japan is a really interesting case because they have a very unique cultural identity and they're very proud of that. But it's also a very modern country, but didn't always necessarily have baked into it this kind of culture of respect for the individual. But now I would say that it does. Taiwan, the history of Taiwan is very much intermingled with that of China, obviously with the PRC. But those countries have gone very divergent routes. And similarly, South Korea, it's not just a capitalist country, but it's also, I think, embodies some of the spirit of the West. So, I think it's not necessarily that the West is a geography. It's also an idea. And I mean, even here down in South Africa, you could say that in many respects, we're kind of part of the broader West. I don't know if every South African necessarily considers themselves a Westerner, but we definitely, a lot of our institutions, a lot of our way of interacting and ordering our society is in the wake of the Western tradition. But yeah, I think something about the founding fathers that Martin and I have often talked about is, yes, they were men of letters, but they were also men of arms. And they were prepared to go to battle for their ideas, and that's something to be remembered and commended. That these were very brave men who really devoted to the idea of liberty, and that's the spirit with which we do our work.
No, absolutely, and yeah, I think that's a great place to end it on. So happy 4th of July to everyone in America, and certainly happy 4th of July to everyone in the world who thinks freedom is a transcendent good that is applicable across time and space. And yeah, let the flower of freedom bloom all around the world, and not just in the geographic West, but also in the East and in the Middle East, maybe more particularly. And of course, don't forget about us here on the southern tip of Africa. We would also like to have some freedom every now and then. But with that, please remember to like this video if you enjoyed this content. Please subscribe to the Rational Standard YouTube channel and click the bell icon if you want to be notified of when we upload new content. We're here every Friday around 12, recording these discussions. Please also visit our Substack. Rational Standard is primarily a text-based kind of platform for articles, which Nicholas Woode-Smith here is our managing editor there. He runs that platform very well for us. So please also have a look at those articles, like them and restack this podcast as well on Substack. And yeah, I think that is it. We will see you all again next week. So thank you for joining us. Cheerio.
Cheers, everyone.